Hello, I'm Karma Kitai, and I'm your host for Alivelihood, New Adventures as We Age. Today I'm going to introduce you to Frinde Maher, and Frinde is going to tell us about how she has forged her own life in a very different way from her family's expectations.
So I was born and raised in a small town north of Boston called Marblehead, Massachusetts, in a neighborhood called Peaches Point, which is full of very old shingle-style summer houses. And I came from a family that was pretty prominent in Boston.
Right.
So
We just talked about that a little bit.
Right.
Your father was an architect?
My father was an architect in Boston. And one of the two things he was very proud of, and I am too, he was one of the founders of the Institute of Contemporary Art.
Oh.
He was on the board of the Museum of Fine Arts. And for 5 years, maybe 10 years in the 50s and 60s, he and a friend of his ran something called the Boston Arts Festival, which was an annual event which put a juried show on the Boston Common. So I grew up as the daughter of an architect whom I admired very much, and also as a member of a certain group of Bostonians whose daughters came out as debutantes. And
we do have a photograph of you.
Yes, me as a
out,
debutante coming out. And on my father's arm, the curtsy had to be to the floor and had to be practiced. And after that, I was sent off to Radcliffe because all the men in our family had gone to Harvard. And by the time my generation came along, even though my mother was not able to complete college, her daughters were. And two of the three of us went to Radcliffe. And I think the messages at Radcliffe were actually very mixed. We were very smart. We were smarter by definition than the Harvard boys because there was only one Radcliffe girl accepted to every 4 Harvard men.
So it was much more
men.
Competitive.
Yes. But once you got there, it was pretty unclear how we were supposed to forge our lives as young women, and this was in the early 1960s. I was the class of 1964. So in college, I cast around, and for the first couple of years of my life in college, I decided to, or didn't decide, just fell into the extension of debutante and prep school life, which is to say that the people that I spent time with were boarding school people and people I knew at debutante parties, and a lot of them were at Harvard, and some of us were at Radcliffe. And I had a wonderful college boyfriend in those early days. But I got
who was also kind of part of that set.
Oh yes, I met him. I met him at my my childhood best friend's coming out party. The whole thing was very safe and comfortable and programmed, and there was a specific slot at Radcliffe for preppy girls. There was even a dorm that was known as where the preppy girls lived, and that's where I lived. And the head of that dorm was known to make exceptions for our curfews if you were coming home from a coming out party. You could stay a little bit later than 1 a.m. if you were coming back from a coming out party. So it really was.
Special dispensation,
yes,
right?
Yes. So I got really, finally bored. Really bored.
With that whole lifestyle.
With that whole lifestyle.
So let me stop you for a minute, Frinde, because so you grew up in this kind of atmosphere, which rarefied, we can say, atmosphere, right?
Yes.
In a beautiful upper middle class, wealthy suburb north of Boston. And I know in the kind of home you grew up in was overlooking the water, right? And
Right.
spacious. And so you were very privileged.
Very.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah.
And had you had any contact at all with people who were not in that atmosphere?
Not really. The air in that world was so thin that when I was growing up, there would be conversations about, for example, people who Marblehead was a yachting community, the yachting capital of the country, quote unquote.
Oh.
And
Did your family yacht?
we certainly did. We did. And I had a little boat called which was, the class was a turnabout. It was about it was as long as the distance between you and me. It was a very tiny little boat. And once a year there would be this thing called Race Week, and boats would come from all over the East Coast. And all of this is by way of saying that I was very excited to go over to Marblehead Harbor and try to participate and get crewing jobs on the big boats. But there was a certain sense that maybe I might run into people who were maybe going to Marblehead High School, and that was not, it was okay. I mean, people from Marblehead High were just fine, but they weren't. They weren't quite the kind of people that one was going to spend a lot of time with. And Marblehead even had a pecking order in yacht clubs. So the Eastern Yacht Club was for the elite. We, of course, were members of the Eastern Yacht Club, and then there were other members of other yacht clubs. And I think one of the things about that world is that very little was actually said. But you just kind of knew that the Corinthian Yacht Club was not quite as elite as the Eastern Yacht Club, and then there were other yacht clubs that barely had names.
Really
You
came in by
internalize it.
osmosis
It comes
somehow.
in by osmosis. You internalize it, and you
Yeah.
internalize the oddest things. You internalize, or I internalize, that people who went to BU weren't as smart and as interesting and as appropriate to know as people who went to Harvard.
Boston University.
That would be Boston University, where I eventually got my doctorate. So, but
And met some people who were
yeah, way smarter than me, way knowledgeable. It was a funny kind of minority world, because it is a minority, but it's not a minority who, I think to this day, understands themselves as a minority. And I've been puzzling for many, many years about how to articulate the blindness of that world to myself and others.
growing up and throughout your adolescence. Do you think you questioned any of that?
I questioned some of it. The way that came out as an adolescent was by learning that there were some people my age who were not as smart as I was. But there were also a lot of people my age who were way richer than we were. This is maybe an aside, but I think it's actually really important in relationship to what I've been thinking about in terms of my whole life. We were the poor people on Peaches Point because we lived there year round. We only had one house. Everybody else in the neighborhood only came for the summer and lived in Chestnut Hill in the winter. So it was very interesting to be smart and poor in boarding school and then go to Radcliffe and be rich and stupid. And that was that was maybe one of my first awakenings, was that there are people at Radcliffe and at Harvard who were way smarter than I was. And I was used to being, the kind of scholarship girl in spite of the big house that I grew up in. So I think those distinctions, those contradictions probably fed into the notion that that life was more complicated than it seemed on the surface.
Right. Huh.
So.
Okay.
So at Radcliffe, I got bored and began to kind of eagerly seek people who weren't the people that I already knew. I had a wonderful boyfriend in my sophomore and junior year who was a college dropout and supposedly a hippie and wrote plays, never got produced. And we went to Provincetown and we hung out with bohemian friends, and I learned about marijuana and all sorts of things like that. And this was in the first couple of years of the 1960s. But that wore thin too. And part of what wore thin about that relationship was that I didn't see that he was going anywhere, and I didn't know really where I was going either, because I didn't want to spend my life on the dunes of Provincetown, really. I wanted to do something. And then things began to emerge, both in my life and in the wider society, that had various groups of people kind of sitting up and paying attention. Fidel Castro came to Harvard in 1959. It was before I got there, but his speech was still kind of echoing off the walls about the youth as the future of this brand new country.
He was idealistic.
He was very idealistic. He was very idealistic, and he created a vision of a democracy which was very compelling, which people talked about. There was the Cuban Missile Crisis. We all thought, this is going to be the end of really civilization.
Life as we know it.
Exactly. Then a year later, Kennedy got assassinated. And by that time, I had come to know some people who were very involved politically. I wish I could say that I woke up one morning and said, I'm going to become an activist. But really, it was the connection of the events in the outside world coming into my life through a group of friends who were pushing out from this very narrow world into a more wider view of what we could do and what they could do. So,
I mean, how you could use yourself to
how could you use
things.
yourself to change, not only, to make some kind of a contribution, but also to change the society. And something that I didn't think of at the time, but boy, do I think of it a lot now, is we were at Harvard and Radcliffe. So we were going to lead the world, right? I mean, we were going to, my father had, made the Boston Arts Festival happen. So I ought to be able to tell LBJ,
powerful.
I thought, it was just a question of, kind of tapping LBJ on the shoulder and saying, hey, stop it. Stop it. Or in the case of Vietnam, or pass it. In the case of the civil rights, we were very empowered. We were very, kind of in love with our own capacities to make change. I miss that. So what happened? That was the 63, 64.
From where you had been when you entered college, right?
Huge.
Yeah.
But I didn't have to question my social class position at all, because we were just Harvard and Radcliffe and people, graduate students, graduate students, who were kind of learning about the world, but we also, again, thought, well, because we're who we are, we can affect this. So there was very little self-criticism, to use a word I learned quite soon after that. There was very little, well, who do you think you are? And quite a lot of doing things for other people. The engagement with the civil rights movement, which I'm very proud of, was very much about those poor other people, rather than you're implicated in this. And it took me
So
years.
you felt very separate from the groups that you were trying to help.
Yeah, they were, yeah, exactly. They needed our help.
Right.
And the Vietnamese needed our help. And on behalf of the Vietnamese, the arrogance of this is breathtaking. But on behalf of the Vietnamese, we were going to help stop the war. Gradually, over that period of time, I graduated in 1964, eventually got a teaching degree, became, during that time also did my stint in a factory. My husband worked in another factory called the Boston Woven Hose, which is down in Kendall Square, quite close to the movie theater now.
Yeah. So was that a common thing for people that you knew to work in a factory?
Yes, because what happened with us was we took, toward the end of, a year after I got out of college, got connected with John Maher, and we started being involved with increasingly left-wing factions of the student movement and the anti-war movement and the civil rights movement. So that by the time 1967, 68 rolled around, John and then I joined an outfit called the Progressive Labor Party, which was a revolutionary communist movement dedicated to the overthrow of the capitalist class.
Okay. Big ideas.
Very big ideas, very big ideas. And I can chart the movement from, let's say, the Martin Luther King March in August 1963, which I did not go to. I had friends who went, but I did not go. Mississippi Summer, 1964, Freedom Summer. I had friends who went there. I did not go. I was still admiring them from afar. To the April 1965 March on Washington against Vietnam, which I did go to, and the 1967 March on the Pentagon, which there's a slide here, I think, about that, where we all were there. So I can chart my own progress in terms of what I went to and what I didn't go on, how I spent my time, and because not only did I work in a factory, but I worked at a place called the Dudley Street Action Center, which was
in Roxbury.
In Roxbury, and working for better welfare payments for the women we were working with. And over time, I began to lose my sense of class superiority. But it took a very long time. It was still about those people. It was about those people for years.
Yeah. So when you did work in a factory in Cambridge.
Right. Well, actually, it was actually in Sullivan Square in Charlestown.
In Charleston.
It was right next door to the Traff's factory, which is a quite famous place.
Right.
And we could smell the chocolate as we were making our fluorescent light bulb starters. And the women on either side of me were so nice to me because I was really slow. I was supposed to be organizing them, which was just a joke because actually they were just helping me get through the day. It was peace rate.
They weren't really so interested in hearing about revolution either, right?
You know, it's funny, but no, they weren't. Go figure. You know, they were interested in going as fast as they could so they would make enough money to feed their families. And I was kind of slowing them up. They were very nice to me. They were really nice to me.
Right.
So with that package, I approached a professional life with, first I was a high school teacher and then I became a teacher trainer. But
so when you were a high school teacher, did you do some work in more poor areas?
I did. I taught at South Boston High School for a year, which was interesting because it was before desegregation. And I decided I began my teaching career in Wellesley, which is, as you know, a pretty rich suburb. And I thought, you know, put your money where your mouth is. So I signed up to teach in Boston. I got a job teaching in Boston. And they put me at South Boston High School before desegregation. So all my students were working class white kids. And that was a real challenge because I was determined to teach about civil rights and
And you were teaching history?
American history.
American history.
Spending 6 weeks on the American Revolution so I could compare it to the war in Vietnam, and then spending another 6 weeks on the civil rights movement.
So what sort of responsiveness did you get from these working class white kids?
They were great. They were pretty, they were kind of, who is this person? Because I wasn't like some of their other teachers. I was younger.
You were in your 20s.
I was in my 20s. I was by that time I was in my late 20s. I'm going to say because of my political position, actually, by that time the Progressive Labor Party and the kind of class analysis we had meant that I could talk to my students about being working class is something that both black and white people shared. And that there's a lot of things in common that they needed to think, that they deserved better from.
Could they take that in?
They were interested. They'd never thought about that before.
So they were curious about
So they
it.
were curious.
Well, that's
They were curious. They were interested.
Would you say you didn't encounter that much racism at the time?
Oh, you could cut it with a knife.
Oh.
I mean, you could cut it with a spoon. I mean, there were students at South Boston High School who came to South Boston from Hingham and Hull and some other places on the South Shore so that they wouldn't have to go to school with black kids from Metco.
Oh, wow.
So the racism was intense.
Okay.
But because it was so out there, it was kind of easier to confront.
Okay, then it would have been in your family home, maybe.
Or Wellesley also. Everybody was very kind of nice in Wellesley, but they weren't. I liked the South Boston kids a lot. They were very direct. So they were easy to, in that sense, they were easy to talk to.
Yeah.
So.
So, okay, so you were teaching for a while, and let's
Right. Then there was a really unhappy divorce. I mean, as in always unhappy. Although my former husband and I get along really well. I had joint custody of our 2 kids by then, and I went back to school and became a college professor of education. And about that time, I've been very lucky in my life. Very, very lucky, because whenever I needed to think things through differently, there was a social movement to support it. I mean, how often does that happen?
Right, right.
So,
So when you became a single mom.
there was the women's movement, just there.
Right there.
Right
just
there.
Waiting for
just
you.
waiting for me. And when I got to Wheaton, which is where I spent 27 wonderful years, there was
a professor.
as a professor of education and women's studies, we were present at the creation. The first time I taught women's feminist theory, which is the advanced women's studies course, there were 10 books. There were only 10 books. I taught it in 1979, 1980. There was Carol Gilligan, and maybe there was Gerda Lerner, but there really were 10 or 15 books, maybe some more articles. Right. By the time I finished teaching it in 2008, it had to become a history course, because it was, well, in the 1980s, this is what we read, and then in the 90s, this is what we read, and then this is, I had to, each year the course lengthened and widened because the field became wider and wider.
Yeah, just burgeoned, yeah.
Which was so wonderful for me intellectually. So I put the education training and my feminism together, and with a friend of mine from Boston University, we wrote a book called The Feminist Classroom, which came out in 1994, and was the first empirical study of what's called feminist pedagogy, which is how do you bring feminist perspectives into teaching and learning, the process of teaching and learning.
Right.
And by that time, I had learned that I could support myself. I learned a little bit about my place in the world. I learned about white privilege. Well, first I should say I'd learned about race in a really different and much more profound way than I'd ever understood in the 60s. I learned about white privilege. I've been lucky enough to have some friends who have taught me quite up close and personal about white privilege. And my being a poster child for it. And so I now find that that what I'm doing is in my current life is continuing to learn.
Right. And in this last minute or two that we have here, I just wanted to bring things up to present. And I know that you've been at the Brandeis, what is it called, Women's Studies program? Right?
Yeah, I do. I'm a resident scholar at the Brandeis Women's Studies Research Center, which is a wonderful place for women of various stages in their career to come and do study groups together. We include artists and musicians as well as writers and scholars.
Right. Yeah.
I'm doing a memoir about all this stuff.
Yeah.
And I'm actually also doing a little bit of tutoring of Harvard graduate students on how to manage being at Harvard graduate school and managing their time, and so which is really, really fun.
Yeah. And so I know that you do consider yourself to be an activist.
And I am working on several things. For a long time, until a couple of years ago, I was on the board of the Boston Women's Fund, which is devoted to helping.
I've given money to that.
Yes, very good. Given money to women's grassroots organizing in the greater Boston area. And now I'm working on a petition to get Harvard to divest from fossil fuels in time for our 50th reunion, which is coming right up.
Yeah.
Harvard's not going to divest from fossil fuels because we asked them to.
You no longer have the power you
Yeah,
did,
right.
did as
I
an
no longer have the
undergrad.
power that I never, ever had. But so that feels good. That feels like it's important. And doing some volunteer work in Cambridge, and actually still doing some diversity work with a friend of mine around college faculties, doing some research on how to diversify college faculties, which was the most recent book that my co-author and I published in 2007.
Right.
So,
Okay, Frinde, thanks so much for being here.
Well, my pleasure.
I'm really fascinated hearing your story.
well, thank you. Thank you.
So join us next time when I will have a new guest on Alivelihood, New Adventures as We Age.